So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ari Maharaj. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the National Eating Disorder Information Center and also a registered psychotherapist. I'm really happy to bring both of these lenses here as we chat today about a project that's really near and dear to my heart, eating disorders among racialized communities, Black folks, Indigenous folks, and broadly people of color. I'm really pleased to be joined by my colleague, Emily, and I'll let her say hi.
I'm so glad to be taking part in this webinar. I don't do them very often, but I was very happy to have this opportunity to co-facilitate this webinar with my colleague Ari. My name is Emily Tam, and my pronouns are she and her, and I serve as NEDIC's Resource Development Coordinator, and by profession, I am a dietitian. And similar to Ari, this is a project that means a lot to me. And so I'm just so glad that all of you are here today to hear more about it.
This webinar is an English language webinar that's going to share some information about two sets of projects, one led by NEDIC in English and one led by our partners at ANEB Québec, who are here today also in French. We have a French language version of this webinar that's being facilitated at 1 p.m. Eastern. After we get going, I'll put that link into the chat. So in case you or someone that you know who's maybe Francophone or would prefer to receive this information in French, you're free to attend that webinar. You can always dual and attend this webinar in English and attend this webinar in French, but know that the content is going to be quite similar. I'm also going to use this opportunity to both get to share some guidelines for today and to honor the land that we're on. And while I'm doing that, I would love folks to put into the chat where they're tuning in from and whose land you're on. It's really great to see some folks from across the country that's colonially known as Canada today, but also some folks who are registered from abroad. I think we are all from one planet Earth, and having some space to honor those intersections will be really important throughout the session today. As always, the chat is going to be open, so feel free to type questions in there throughout. And if you feel like you would like to mention something out loud, don't hesitate to do so. Just know that your video will likely end up being recorded. I'm going to acknowledge that NEDIC supports people from all across the land, presently all Canada, and our office is located in Toronto, on lands described in the Dish with One Spoon, a treaty between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee that binds them to share the territory and protect the land. Indigenous peoples of many nations have lived here for at least the last 15,000 years and continue to live here to this day. We believe that we are all treaty people, and for NEDIC colleagues who are not Indigenous to this land, this acknowledgement is a reminder to appreciate and recognize how our relationship with the land, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, is interconnected with how people can experience disordered eating. We also think it's important to recognize that in the field of eating disorders, both we and our clients often work with dietitians, with social workers, and with therapists, and each of those professions all have their own complex history with settler colonization. In Canada, dietitians participated on experiments on Indigenous children at the Indian residential school system without their or their family's knowledge or consent. Social workers and therapists have removed Indigenous children from their homes and sent them to residential schools or to foster care. Therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists have embedded whiteness into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which continues to be a prevailing document used in the mental health field. And these are just a few examples of the way that these processes of colonization permeate the field and the work that we do and create impacts that persist to this day. Treatment and access to treatment is still shaped by these wrongs and the impacts of these generational traumas. And I think we're really happy to have an opportunity today to talk about all of this and some work that's maybe being done to help contribute to healing in different ways. It's been really lovely to see some of the chat messages that have come in throughout this, and I think we're gonna get going. So let me spotlight myself for everybody. And let me also spotlight Emily for everybody. Cool. Here are our goals for our webinar today. We're going to learn about new resources that we've created with and for Black folks, Indigenous folks, and folks of color. We're going to hear about the process for community engagement and the lessons learned, and hopefully these are processes that you all listening might be able to take some lessons and apply to your own work. Hopefully you will receive some insights from our guidance for healthcare providers on providing culturally sensitive care for people with eating disorders. And you're also going to learn about a new French language support group that's going to be offered by ANEB in Quebec for BIPOC communities as a service offering. So a place for those of you who are here with your own lived experience to potentially go to, or for those referring Francophone clients to potentially refer to. And I will toss to my colleague, Em.
Just for those of you who aren't already familiar with NEDIC, NEDIC is a registered nonprofit organization and a program of the University Health Network in Toronto, part of its Center for Mental Health. And we have three main program areas, which I will just briefly outline. We operate a national toll-free helpline, a telephone line, and a live chat service that's staffed by a trained support team that's available to anyone across Canada. And the service is free of charge, anonymous, and confidential. So anyone can contact us, whether they're an affected person, whether they're a family member, carer, or friend, regardless of whether or not a diagnosis is involved, and receive in-the-moment support, referrals, and resources. We have a robust community education programming offering, and we deliver live educational workshops in person in the Greater Toronto area and virtually across Canada. And these workshops focus on the prevention and early intervention of eating disorders. And we really aim to create environments that are body inclusive, where people feel accepted and respected just as they are. And we also have a national resource library, a service provider directory, and we do a lot of work engaging with partners around the country with shared mandates.
Share a little bit in English about our partners for the webinar today, ANEB Québec. They're a nonprofit based in Montreal, but it gets to offer service to the whole province of Quebec, both in French and in English. They offer support and resources to people living with eating disorders, as well as the loved ones and professionals who work with them. So really similar mandate in terms of population to NEDIC. They offer immediate free help to those in need through different services. And we're going to have a chance really briefly to walk through some of those services for those who aren't as familiar. ANEB's been in the field for 35 years. And so we're really happy to get a chance to get to work with them to provide this kind of work in English and in French. There's a wide plethora of services here, open and closed support groups, a telephone helpline and live chat, and like NEDIC, but in addition to NEDIC, texting services, a help forum, and education and prevention work. Services are available to people at different stages of their journey and of all ages, 12 plus, and folks of varying gender identities. In particular, the support groups, which is of note for what we're going to be talking about today, are available for folks who are 17 plus, and their opportunity for both mutual support and getting to speak confidentially with other people who understand the impact of eating disorders on their life. They have two main kinds of support groups, one of them being open and one of them being closed. Open support groups have some different themes, all free and confidential, and taking place through Zoom, facilitated by a trained member of ANEB, but different groups meet on different days. So currently there's offerings on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Closed support groups are 2 hours per week and run for a fixed duration between 8 and 14 weeks. Again, we're facilitated here by two trained members of ANEB, and there's a max of 10 people per group. The commitment here is important, and participants can be prepared to attend for all meetings. These groups meet every other Wednesday, and you can always see a full schedule at anebquebec.com. Similar to NEDIC, I think that in the moment support piece is really important for ANEB. There's a listening and reference line that are available that anyone of all ages can reach out to, and that can be people who have experienced an eating disorder or currently experiencing an eating disorder, as well as the loved ones who are supporting them, whether that's parents, caregivers, community workers, health professionals. And you can see that wide-ranging hours of operation there on the slide. If folks are looking for online help, you can always email ANEB at info@anebquebec.com or look at their support forum at forum.anebquebec.com. They have a specific website for young people directly, anebados.com, and then chat, which often they're finding a lot of young people are using 12 and over. Ditto texting, often something that a lot of youth are using 12 and over. So let's dive into some of the goals of our work together when we decided to embark on this initiative, because I think everybody here probably knows that this has been a long time coming. We know that there are really documented systemic barriers for people of color in accessing care. And we're not going to spend really any time in this webinar documenting those systemic barriers, because we think that A, people know that, and B, there is some information in text on the resources which can document that from those folks with a living and lived experience for you to read their words directly. Instead, we're going to focus this webinar more so on the process that it took to develop something, in hopes that you all can get some lessons from that, as well as get to show you some tangible resources and skills that you might be able to use and others might be able to use to actually help the people who we're talking about here in their own lives. We really want to spearhead more inclusive eating disorder supports for these communities. And two of many ways to do that is through the provision of educational resources and the creation of new support services. And that's what we're going to get a chance to talk to you about today. So we'd like to hear from you all as attendees, and you can share this in the chat if you don't want to be captured by the recording, because we can just read that out loud. Or if you were comfortable unmuting and sharing something out loud, knowing that your face and your voice will probably appear in the recording, feel free to do that. We're really curious as to what challenges you faced when receiving care as a person of color, for those of you who are in attendance today, or for those of you providing care, trying to provide care for those of the BIPOC community. Feel free to share from either lens, and Emily and I can read out some of those answers in the chat, or we'll prioritize accordingly if we see multiple people come off mute. But let's share our reflections. If someone's sharing confidentially through the Zoom direct message, which you're free to do, I'm saying that even if someone has tried to access care, it doesn't mean that the care they're going to receive is always going to be tailored to them. So thank you. Someone in our Zoom chat to everyone saying, in receiving care, being overlooked for years, no one taking issues seriously, even when trying to get help, i.e. potentially from doctors. Someone else confidentially messaging that in receiving care, potentially having to divide themselves in order to receive care. And feel free to share a little bit more about what that means to you, but in the way that I've taken that, like maybe feeling like you can only show a part of yourselves or a part of your experience. Maybe I can just talk about this aspect of the eating disorder, but not necessarily these aspects. And there could be many reasons for that. Someone confidentially messaging in trying to provide care, the fear of screwing up. Yeah, sometimes you can be super well intended, but feeling like, uh-oh, like am I accidentally gonna say something that might be harmful? And I think like learning ways in which we can repair when harm has been done is like such a crucial skill to learn when thinking about working with anybody, but especially folks from potentially holding different identities than you might hold. Some other folks in our in our Zoom public chat, in providing care, witnessing BIPOC folks struggling to navigate predominantly white spaces in group settings. Yeah, I get to facilitate an English language support group for Sheena's Place, offered virtually online for people in Ontario. And I feel like there's been so many folks who potentially access services in other group spaces and might initially come into the space that I coordinate with like this heightened sense of fear, right? This like distrust, this like, oh, like, is this going to be another one of those spaces where I'm feeling like I have to be really vigilant? And vigilance can be such a deterrent to actually being vulnerable and opening up in a support group space. But sometimes those first 2-3 sessions can feel like people are kind of like walking on eggshells a little bit, or like feeling the group out because maybe they've had to navigate predominantly different spaces before and like don't even know what it's like to open up in a different way. Some other folks sharing in both giving and receiving care. Practices and policies being white/Western centric with little flexibility for including different values, beliefs, and traditions. Thanks for sharing. I like hear that a lot in the resources. There's folks who mention intersections with like spirituality here too, and how sometimes that is either like not taken into account or maybe only seen in a really like Abrahamic Western religious way, and not necessarily like with like Eastern philosophies or Indigenous philosophies. Someone else in providing care, breaking stigmas and misconceptions, helping people see that it's not just a thin, white, affluent person issue. Thank you. Someone sharing, I didn't know at the time what I was describing was an eating disorder or body dysmorphia, but I was describing it quite clearly to many health professionals for many years as a teen in mental health. I was repeatedly gaslit and validated. I also existed in a larger body on top of being biracial. And so like those multiple lenses potentially being like, they're not able to be held. Someone else in providing care. Sometimes having the conversations catered to white folks in the group, especially when, or the comfort of white folks, especially when racialized concerns are brought into the space by BIPOC clients. Yeah, I think that can be super tricky to like navigate the like power dynamics. And I think you'll see in some of the healthcare guidance, hopefully like a lot of it, I think, is about power and trauma and like how do we give power back to our service users and our clients to give them the self-determination to navigate how they want to proceed in whatever healing care their journey wants to be. Anyone else want to share out loud or in the chat? I'll give it one more minute before we keep going. While some of the resources, especially the guidance for healthcare providers that we'll show you, have an extensive reference list with a lot of citations, like adding to these systemic barriers, I also want to make the point here that like we are also evidence too, right? The lived experiences that you all are sharing in the chat and the stories. The reason why I think we chose to do some informational resources is to capture the stories and the quotes of like real human beings who've experienced the impact of these experiences, and what they would like to see instead is like such a central theme and pillar of doing this work, really listening to and giving space to those in community to then move forward. Okay, why don't we let Emily walk us through the process that that NEDIC took in getting to create some of these resources.
All right, so we'll talk about how we came up with this process of co-developing informational resources for members of BIPOC communities and for supporting members of BIPOC communities. And there's such a lack of informational resources specific to eating disorders in BIPOC community members. And so this leaves many of those who are affected with eating disorders who belong to these groups with unmet support and treatment needs. And eating disorders in BIPOC individuals are frequently unrecognized and undiagnosed. And then even when they are identified, many BIPOC folks encounter a multitude of barriers to receiving the support and treatment that they deserve. And then within the majority of the eating disorder resources and services that are currently available, the various factors that influence the ways in which members of BIPOC communities experience eating disorders are totally not adequately addressed, if they even are. And this is why NEDIC was so excited to receive funding from the Slate Family Foundation to develop informational resources on eating disorders with and for members of BIPOC communities in Canada. And this funding enabled us to develop resources in a way that allowed us to stick by our values and compensate contributors appropriately for their time and work and their love, and working alongside BIPOC eating disorder experts from coast to coast, which included individuals with lived experience, professionals engaging in treatment, and researchers. We created a collection of resources for members of BIPOC communities and for supporting members of BIPOC communities, meaning material for people who themselves are affected by eating disorders, as well as guidance, which Ari has referenced already, for healthcare practitioners in providing culturally sensitive care to BIPOC clients. So how did we get just from this idea to actually producing tangible materials? So we'll talk a little bit about that. Well, this all goes back to spring of last year, 2022. So recognizing that BIPOC community is itself comprised of incredibly diverse groups of people, we didn't want to just create one thing for all BIPOC folks. And we appreciate that even within the 6 groups that we decided to organize around, there are just so many different cultures that we just cannot capture every single experience. We came up with a rough outline of what we were thinking the collection could consist of. So a unique resource for each of the following 6 groups: Black, Indigenous, East and Southeast Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, and Latine, and an outline of the roles that community members could choose as the way that they wanted to be involved. So they could participate as a consultant or a content writer and or a reviewer. And between June and July of last year, we conducted outreach to community members to let them know about the launch of this resource development project and the different roles that they could choose to take on. And this involved sending information to our mailing list subscribers and members of our networks, and posting information on our social media platforms. And then we invited community members to meet with us, meaning Ari and I, on a one-on-one basis to learn more about the project and let us know how they were interested in being involved. From there, between July and August, we held introductory conversations and pieced together our project team. And throughout the summer, we also held individual consultations with members of the project team. So that entailed meeting for about 90 minutes and having conversations in which we gathered their personal and professional insights relating to the relationships between culture and eating disorders, and their ideas about what would be important and helpful to include in the resources. Between August and December, the members of our writing team met on a biweekly basis with Ari and I facilitating. We also had a couple of NEDIC volunteers who are very involved in the process. In the first few meetings, our group discussed themes to address and elements to include in the resources, and we had discussions about how the resources might be similar to each other and how they might be different. And then the later meetings focused more on small group work, in which our mini writing team, so to speak, worked together to draft the contents of the resources. And then between December and February of this year, we had a review team that read through the drafts of the resources that they had signed on to review. And then for the NEDIC team as editors, we took into consideration viewers' feedback and revised the drafts according to their comments and suggestions, which takes us to our next slide, where you can see the homepage of where our resource collection lives. So all of these resources are available for free on the NEDIC website, and you see the main page here, nedic.ca/BIPOC, and Ari's going to scroll down, and you'll be able to see the names of the folks who were part of the project team and their biographies. And we had a really wonderful team of folks from across the country, literally from coast to coast. And it was such a privilege for Ari and I to get to work with everyone on this team. And then from here, you can navigate to each of the community-specific resources, and Ari's going to open one of these pages up so we can take a look at it together. So there's a PDF file that's linked here, which you can view online as well as download. And then, as I mentioned, there's reference lists and resource lists that provide some additional readings, other services that BIPOC folks might find helpful. And we'll just scroll through a few of the pages of let's talk about disordered eating and eating disorders in the Indigenous communities.
Something to really highlight is like that there's both texts that community members wrote themselves, and they've also included first-person narratives in the form of these green quote boxes. So when you see green quotes, that's a writer who has chosen to share a bit of their story in first person as it pertains to, in this case, Christine sharing about misinformation and stigma. Or in this case, Christine and Lolita sharing about colonialism and beauty standards and the myths around beauty. So you can both get kind of content knowledge, and community members can get content knowledge, and also that living lived experience first person narrative directly in the resource itself. The other thing to mention, like Emily shared, is that like while everyone as a writing group might have chosen to all write about healing and getting help, the way that it looks for each community resource was tailored by that community for that community. And some of the folks in this resource, for instance, really wanted to have a section on traditional healing practices from Indigenous community members. And so they were able to write in that section and included some pieces around it and included some quotes too. And you'd see that in each of the resource collections. And if ever you share this with a community member or you read this yourself, you can always scan that QR code and give us thoughts on a feedback form specific to this.
Link to a brief Google form, and we're always happy to receive feedback and keep that for hopefully future resource development in this space. These resources, I will also mention, will be available in French as well. We don't have a time frame to share with you just yet, but please know that they are on their way.
Before
we'll
we
hand
go
things
any
back over.
further, anyone have any questions about that text resource collection? You can ask us questions about the process. You can ask us questions about things that were included. But let's just pause here and see if anyone has anything to share out loud or in the chat. Someone's making a point in confidential messaging, sorry, that they're really glad to see that it's not just BIPOC as a whole. And yeah, like I think when we were applying for funding and to get funding for something like this, to group communities of color together is one way to do that, and BIPOC being a way, like a term that's being used right now to do it. But I think it was always really important for us as a team and the wider team, and also Emily and I, to make sure that we know that being a person of color isn't like a monolithic experience, right? Like we all kind of have our own individual intersections, our own differences. And even within these 6 groups that are chosen, there's like really big differences between people living in Cambodia versus people living in China versus people living in Vietnam. And even though they'd all fall into the East and Southeast Asian community members bucket in this case, trying to capture some of the nuances of the stories, we wanted to still make sure that there was some way that folks would find visibility somehow. And I think there's a way that we can like celebrate all the ways that we're similar and also celebrate all the ways that we're a little different. And this resource is maybe just a starting point for us to get the chance to do that. We have a chat question where people are wondering about like multimedia, like videos and stuff. And so while the PDFs themselves don't have videos inserted, some of the resource links that are on the web pages, and so I'll scroll back, you might be able to find further resources that aren't created by NEDIC, but are ones that we can link to in this part of the website page. And sometimes there are some multimedia pieces there. It just kind of depends on what the writers decided that they wanted to share as resources in this case. So I'll scroll back and you can see for East and Southeast Asian folks, you can see a different resource list that's here. Sometimes there are videos and stuff that are included in that, but not necessarily embedded within the PDFs. Thanks for asking.
And we purposely chose to keep the resource list separate from the PDF document because we want to be able to add things as they come out, because things are always changing, and we wanted to make sure that this list can be as up to date as possible.
Yeah, which also means for all of you as community members watching this webinar, if you ever have resources that you think are really cool that maybe you want to advocate for being linked here, don't hesitate to reach out and connect with us, and we're happy to see if there's a space to amplify some of that work. Okay, I don't see other questions. I'm going to keep moving and grooving. When we've had a chance to work with ANEB around engaging community members, their community engagement process, as you can imagine, both given the language and the geographical change, looked a little bit different. ANEB wanted to reach out as much as possible to community members and gather their feedback. And when they were having a chance to do that, it's how they landed on creating a new support group service as something that they can do. As most of you, all of you might know, NEDIC does not provide support groups as a service that we can do. And even if folks were to bring that up, we will help link to other English language supports that potentially are available. Whereas ANEB does provide support groups. It's a really cool aspect of their service, and potentially creating one for community members was something that they had the ability to do. They were able to work with a community identified external consultant that worked in eating disorders to survey the community in hopes of hearing the voices of many people as possible, often using social media to share a survey, sharing the project with partner organizations. And the external consultant, Marbella, also helped ANEB highlight important considerations for the creation of the group in terms of hiring and training practices for a staff member, as well as some suggestions for the structure of the new group itself. Since then, it's given ANEB some time to make the community organization themselves more inclusive and representative, from hiring people of color more consistently and consciously, to elaborating on a new social media strategy that includes more representation of the different perspectives that all have eating disorders, as we strive to update how our community perceives both who's affected by eating disorders and ANEB themselves. When community is asked to engage, it doesn't always mean that they will automatically engage. And especially for an organization starting out on a process, it might feel different and it might be more difficult to create that safety and trusting bond with community members right away. And I think as organizations, being able to do the hard work of recognizing and reflecting where you're at in that trust and safety process with community is a really important step in thinking about the kinds of outcomes that we're going to get from them. And it's a really key lesson that we were able to see in the process of this work. Some of the lessons learned from community engagement is that there's no real copy-paste template for a genuine, authentic engagement with a community. There are lessons that NEDIC learned when facilitating engagement in English, and while some of the lessons were helpful, they weren't always applicable in Quebec, for instance. And when bringing BIPOC team members onto a project, we thought it was really important to take the time to learn how you can care for them as a whole being. You saw Emily walk through how NEDIC tried to do that in the processes of our community engagement in that summer, July, August period, and ANEB doing that with Marbella's work, and then having to shift some training and hiring practices in order to be able to ask some important questions. When we are translating this back out for you, some of the questions that stood out that are potentially ones that folks here can take away for their own organizations is asking your service users or team members of color, like, can you share some of your strengths or past experiences and how you may use them to support your role in this work? Is there anything else you'd like us to know about the ways in which we can help support you feeling like you can meaningfully participate in this experience with us? And we fully expect that throughout your time with us, there will be some conversation topics or tasks or activities that heighten our own mental health responses. How can we help with the comfort of folks sharing that up front? And how can we help support you when something like this comes up? All questions to potentially get from or have a conversation about near the beginning in order to create a process that is hopefully going to work for everybody. Anyone else in the audience have lessons about community engagement that you all have run? Or I know that we have a lot of folks of color who are in attendance today. Any questions or supports that you found were really helpful for you that you want to share with other attendees here? Things you want to add on, or even maybe different experiences you have? I'll hold space for 2-3 minutes. Someone's confidentially messaging saying that the urgency in nonprofit spaces can be a stressor. I'll feel free to elaborate more on that, what that means for you, but in the way that I'm taking that, I think sometimes the fact that there are often funding deadlines or the timelines that we set out for a process, like a hiring process or a resource development process, might not always be conducive to creating spaces that we can take care of an entire person. I think for Emily and I don't know, and when we initially sketched this out, we had an idea of trying to timeline the resources to be done in December or something like that. And we tried our best to make sure that we had some buffer room. Even with that buffer room, I think having some flexibility as the process continued to be able to say, hey, can we show funders interim pieces? Hey, can we still support this person in this way? Or can we launch this right now and then make a change? Like, those are all things that I think we had to consider because we wanted to make sure that we were doing this work authentically and meaningfully, and stuff for everyone to consider here too.
The stress was definitely real,
Mhm.
even though we did build in that buffer space.
Mhm.
But we were also very grateful to our funders who had the understanding that projects like these, work like this, it does take time. And we were very appreciative of their understanding.
Anyone else with any thoughts out loud or in the chat? Otherwise, I might keep going. Okay. If you're typing, feel free to keep typing, but I'm going to keep going. When we move to the guidance for healthcare providers, so let's flip back to the website for a second. These resources are all community written for community members themselves. So people with their own living and lived experience can read these. Sure, people supporting them can read them too, and healthcare professionals can also read these. But it also became really apparent that we needed some specific guidance that was targeted towards healthcare providers as an audience. And if you scroll up on the site, you'll see this page that says guidance for healthcare providers, that Emily, myself, and one of our awesome NEDIC volunteers, Anisha, and some help from another volunteer named Anna, helped put together, really pulling from community and getting to write this on behalf of them for healthcare providers. You can download that full resource here. It's also in a PDF version, and there's some additional tools that are listed here too. But we decided for the purpose of this webinar to get to go through a few sections of it to give some folks here some chunkable tools that they might be able to take away. The resource is really geared to any professional working with people affected by eating disorders and doesn't really talk about profession-specific tips and strategies, but more like philosophical and approach-based tips and strategies. And the table of contents for that resource includes what you see in the bullet points there. Misconceptions and myths about what an eating disorder looks like and what health and recovery mean. Getting to highlight in a few pages some structural barriers to care for people of color seeking care for their eating disorder. And then most importantly, some considerations for providing trauma-sensitive care, practicing from a stance of cultural humility, and supporting someone without a support network. And then we have some external link to resources to enhance practice. Over the next 2 slides, we'll show a snapshot of some of the content included in the resource and get your thoughts, and feel free to, we'll pause after each slide if you have something that you want us to speak more to. So here are some principles that our team members put together around being trauma sensitive when supporting people of color. There are some definitions within the resource itself around like what trauma sensitive means to us. And just like we'll talk about what cultural humility means to us. But for now, 3 of the many recommendations include making historical or racial trauma a conversation point in treatment can be valuable as an act of healing in and of itself. You might be able to ask something like, what has happened to you? Can we talk about this? And if your practice asks about social identity, like gender or race on an intake form, give people an opportunity to also honor that intersection like qualitatively in conversation as a part of care planning. Even just setting the stage with something like that before we get to symptoms and et cetera, is also really an important point of context for that service user. We can also work to understand the intergenerational impacts at play. We can explore what boundary setting looks like while centering a client's sense of respect and fairness. Asking questions like, what would a positive outcome look like in this situation? Does this feel fair to you? Does this feel fair to the other person? And having some space to actually have a conversation about that can be different than saying that like boundaries have to be set with people who Potentially there's a cultural dynamic between that might be difficult, like someone with their parents or someone with their grandparents or aunts and uncles, that culturally it actually might feel really hard and stressful to speak back or set a boundary harshly with someone like that, with an elder. That doesn't mean boundary setting is not possible, but it means we have to center that client's sense of respect or fairness. An example that a team member gave was like normalizing that we might not be able to change the mindset of a family member, but we could still create a situation that protects ourselves and potentially other people like nieces or nephews or children in the family environment a bit more than before. And they were sharing that like we have to be really careful about putting labels onto a client, like your parents sound abusive from you or a group member or another provider, because there really could be culturally normative behaviors or systemic conditions at play, and the client might really retreat if they believe that the culture is being pathologized. Instead, like creating some space to explore how they feel about certain family members and talk about what kind of relationship they want to have gives you a chance to potentially also like grieve the relationship that they wish they had while they also reconcile with their present reality. The last recommendation that we'll talk about really briefly is to just like label and name structural issues as structural issues. Naming potential environmental factors and asking your client how they see the influences of these factors in their life and discussing who is responsible for that might be freeing for a client and disrupt their own internalized narrative of like shame and self-blame. For instance, like acknowledge for clients who might have been deprived of access to cultural foods because of geographical displacement or colonization or migration or poverty, that like healing from their eating disorder then in that case might be particularly complicated. And for those who lacked opportunities to develop an understanding of their culture's foodways, we might look to like reestablish a positive relationship with food through re-engagement with their culture's foodways, and know that like that might be more difficult of a process for them if they're comparing themselves to clients who haven't experienced that type of deprivation. It might take longer, might be a little bit more complex, might require some extra coaching, but still something that could be a worthy talking point. Thinking. Anyone have any questions about what we have on this slide, or have things you want to add before we move on? The only thing I'm getting confidentially is that some people are liking what they're seeing. If you are liking what you're seeing, you can put that in the public chat too if you want. But I think if you're typing, keep typing, but let me move on. When we thought about putting together these resources, we decided to use the term cultural humility instead of cultural competency. And we decided to define it using a series of principles that we've put into a table in the resource. Fundamentally, I think we believe that the very foundations of cultural humility, like not making assumptions about people based on their culture, and instead getting curious about each person and their context as a learner, not an expert, is really useful, not just for every practitioner to use with every client, including white clients, but every human being. I think there's lots of value in self-reflection to figure out how our client relationship fits within wider positions of privilege, and that acknowledging these realities outwardly and actively navigating together how we can come through and move through that is beneficial in whatever setting or institution that you're practicing in. Here are some ways to potentially do that. One recommendation is to work to understand power dynamics and what it would mean to give back power to your client. For instance, in your initial appointment, informing clients of their rights, talking openly about ways they can offer you feedback, and speak about your sense of responsibility as a healthcare provider. You can model to clients that you understand that race and culture and eating disorders aren't monoliths, maybe even using some of the language that Emily and I have shared with you today. 2, we can explore cultural knowledges that can be used to develop healing narratives. For instance, we can invite clients to talk about cultural teachings that have been passed down to them that might help them feel grounded, or that increase their sense of interconnectedness to themselves and their values and their culture and other people around them. And 3, I think especially for my nutrition professionals in the audience, like recognizing that cultural value of food, right? Openly appreciating how food is about more than just biological nourishment, and allow for time to try to understand that relationship with your clients. Even if you don't potentially know that, you can expand your understanding of cultural foods through experiential learning. And there's examples of like taking a chance for yourself to look up recipes or go to a grocery store and engage with another food, and explore what that might mean and how that might potentially look then for a client who maybe has had that relationship altered in whatever way. All some different ways to potentially take stances of cultural humility. Anyone have anything they want to share on this? Examples, other ways, other things that have made them feel really connected to their healthcare provider? Otherwise, we'll get close to wrapping up. And I'll toss back to Emily.
Well, we are thrilled for our friends at ANEB who have worked really thoughtfully to develop a support group for French-speaking members of the BIPOC communities. So this new group will be launching on October 10th. So it's Tuesday, October 10th. And it'll be in the evening from 7 to 9. And it'll take place on Zoom, free of charge and confidential. And if you'd like more information about the group, you can contact ANEB at group.uber.aneb@gmail.com. In the interest of time, I won't talk about the themes that are going to be addressed across the 8 sessions that comprise the group program. I'll just leave them here for a moment, and then we'll proceed to the next slide with some more information about how you can register or learn more about the support group.
So this registration is now open. You can visit the link below to register, and we will put that link in the chat for folks, in addition to also having the link sent out in your Eventbrite follow-up email with the slides. Participants will receive a phone call following their registration for confirmation, and know that you can always scan that QR code that you currently have on that slide, or like take a picture of that and send that to someone, or attach it as an email PDF or something like that to a client, should you think that'll be really helpful in helping them access the service. Otherwise, though, I think we can pause here for any final reflections or comments from you all as an audience. Anyone else have any thoughts before we go for the day? And go as in go to our French language version of this webinar. We're getting some positive comments in the chat, so thanks folks for sharing some of the things that you're taking away from today. Again, a benefit of all of this stuff is that it's currently free for everybody, right? So stuff that folks can share with people widely and hopefully access as one start of transforming the current system of care for people of color trying to access eating disorder supports. Okay, then maybe we shall wave goodbye and I'll stop the recording. So thank you so much for attending, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today.